This is the story of how the South was born, and this is the story of the Promised Land. It's me. Welcome to my channel, where I discuss real-life events that have taken place in the United States of America. As the North was coming together, a coalition of states was also forming in the far-off distance down south. They were bound together by the common threads of racism, religion, and cotton. We'll talk about all three of those, but first we have to talk about how they got started. After the Revolutionary War, the original 13 colonies still held 11 free states to 9 slave states. But the balance of power was shifting. As the first decade of the 1800s came to a close, many Americans began talking about adding new lands to the Union. James Monroe, who was president at the time, had taken a crack at this with his Monroe Doctrine, which warned European powers not to interfere with the affairs of the Americas. But it didn't stop there. He went on to call for the United States to take Florida from Spain, which he successfully did, and then he set his sights on the area between the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. Now, before we go any further, we have to talk about how Americans were thinking about land. In their minds, the western frontier wasn't just empty wilderness. No, it was ripe with opportunity. The fertile lands were just waiting for them to come and farm them. There were rivers full of fish just waiting to be caught and vast tracts of lumber just waiting to be chopped down. It was all there for the taking. In fact, the only thing that could stand in their way of this manifest destiny were the Native Americans who lived there. And so, while white Americans saw this land as opportunity, they also saw Native Americans as obstacles. And those obstacles had to be removed. So what did they do? Well, they forced them west, killing anyone who resisted and assimilating anyone who didn't. But back to James Monroe. After getting Florida from Spain, he sent General Andrew Jackson into the Louisiana Territory to do the same thing, kill and assimilate. And that's exactly what he did. By 1816, Jackson had defeated the resistance and claimed the entire region for the United States. This region became the 16th state of the Union, Mississippi, and its admission into the Union tipped the balance of power. Once again, there were now 12 free states and 12 slave states. And this would not stand. The balance of power in Congress was now precarious, and both sides wanted more representation. The Missouri Compromise had already admitted Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state, keeping the balance of power intact. But everyone knew that wouldn't last forever. So, with each new territory being settled, everyone waited anxiously to see which side would tip the scales. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the South. Ever since the days of slavery, Southerners had been clinging to the belief that they were racially superior. Even after slavery ended, Southern states passed laws called Black Codes, which attempted to keep former slaves subservient to whites. For example, black people couldn't own property unless a white person co-signed for them. They were barred from testifying in court against white people, and they couldn't serve in public office. But when that didn't work, Southerners doubled down with the Jim Crow laws, which were even more restrictive. In fact, the term Jim Crow came from a minstrel character named Thomas Rice, who performed in blackface and songs that demeaned black people. These laws were enforced through violence and intimidation, and they kept black people from voting, owning property, and even walking on the street. And it wasn't just black people either. Anyone who tried to help them was also targeted. And then along comes Nat Turner, a preacher and former slave who wanted to fight back against these racist policies. On August 21, 1831, he led a group of 40 men in a rebellion against the state of Virginia. At first, they were successful, killing more than 50 people. But eventually, they were surrounded and forced to flee. And soon enough, Nat Turner himself was captured and executed. His rebellion shook the South to its core, and it inspired a new wave of racist policies that made life even harder for black people. And that's why so many of them were looking to the West for a better life. At the same time, the United States was making some big moves out west. In 1845, Texas was annexed into the Union. In 1846, the Mexican-American War broke out. And in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, which gave the United States even more land. All of this meant that more and more people were moving to the South, bringing with them their hopes and dreams for a better life. Now, remember what I said earlier about manifest destiny? Well, that's really important here because the settlers who moved to the South believed that God had given them the right to take this land from the Native Americans and use it for farming and ranching. In fact, they saw themselves as superior to the Native Americans because they were white, and that meant that they had a duty to spread Christianity among the Native Americans. But if the Native Americans refused to convert, then the settlers had no choice but to remove them from the land. That's what happened to the Cherokee. In the early 1800s, the Cherokee were living in peace in their homeland in the southeast. But as more and more settlers moved into the area, things began to change. The settlers wanted the Cherokee land for themselves, and they weren't afraid to use force to get it. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which forced the Cherokee and other Native American tribes to move west. The Cherokee fought back, but it wasn't enough. In 1838, the U.S. Army came to take them from their homes, and as they marched west, thousands of them died. Those who survived were forced to live in poverty on a small reservation in Oklahoma. Now the South was officially becoming itself. It had its own identity, its own culture, and its own values. Religion played a major role in this. The South was known as the Bible Belt because most people there were very religious. They believed in traditional values like hard work, family, and community. They also believed in racial hierarchy, and this was reinforced by the Bible Belt. In fact, many white Southerners used the Bible to justify slavery. They believed that black people were cursed to be slaves and that it was their duty to obey their white masters. Cotton was another important part of the South's identity. It was a cash crop that was in high demand around the world, and it was extremely profitable. In fact, cotton was so profitable that it led to the expansion of slavery. As more and more plantations grew cotton, they needed more and more slaves to work the fields, and this created a vicious cycle. The more cotton they grew, the more slaves they needed. The more slaves they had, the more cotton they grew. And it was this reliance on cotton that made the South so dependent on slavery. As we move toward the Civil War, we can see these three forces at play: racism, religion, and cotton. They're all part of what made the South unique, and they're all part of what led to its downfall. By the 1850s, the South was a very different place than the rest of the country. It was mostly rural with a small population of cities. Most people worked in agriculture, and they were very dependent on the slave labor. The South was also much poorer than the North. While the northern states were industrializing and growing, the South was stuck in the past. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the South was unprepared. It didn't have the industrial base or the population to compete with the North, but it did have something else: a cause worth fighting for. The South was fighting to preserve its way of life. It was fighting to keep slavery legal, and it was fighting to maintain its racial hierarchy. The South was also fighting to join the Confederacy, a new country that would be formed by the southern states. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the South fought bravely. Its armies were led by some of the best generals in history, and they were able to hold off the North for years. But in the end, it wasn't enough. The North was too strong, and the South was defeated. In the end, the South was born out of the desire for freedom and equality. Despite the horrors of slavery, black people never gave up hope for a better life. They dreamed of a land where they could be free to worship God, to speak their minds, and to raise their children without fear. And in the end, that's what they had. And that's why the South will always be the promised land. If you enjoyed this video, please leave me a like, and if you love this kind of content, please subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.